Welcome to Dr. Harmony, the place where we unmask the hidden truths of the heart and witness the incredible power of the human spirit. Today's story is a chilling reminder that the person you look down on today might be the one you beg for mercy from tomorrow. Have you ever been pushed so far by the person who was supposed to love you that you had no choice but to vanish and reinvent yourself? Today, we explore the life of Mark, a man who endured years of silent humiliation before turning the tables in the most calculated way possible. This is a journey of betrayal, hidden wealth, and a divorce that no one saw coming. Stay with us until the very end, because the way this man chooses to settle the score will leave you speechless. Let's dive into the shadows of a broken marriage and the light of a cold, hard revenge. The cold air in the living room was thicker than the winter frost outside, but the chill didn't come from the weather. It came from Elena's voice. Mark sat at the small kitchen table, his large, calloused hands wrapped around a mug of lukewarm coffee. He was 40 years old, a man who had spent 2 decades working long hours in construction, his skin darkened by the sun and etched with the dust of 1,000 job sites. To the world, he was a provider. To his wife, he was an eyesore. Elena stood by the window, her silk robe shimmering under the expensive chandelier, a chandelier Mark had paid for with 3 months of overtime. She didn't look at him. She never really looked at him anymore. She looked through him, as if he were a piece of furniture that had gone out of style. "You're late with the mortgage money again, Mark," she said, her voice dripping with a casual disdain that cut deeper than any blade. "I don't understand how a man of your age can be so content with being a nobody. Look at you. You come home smelling of sweat and dirt, darkening my floors with your presence. It's embarrassing to take you to dinner with my friends. They have husbands who own firms, men who wear suits that cost more than your truck, and I have you." Mark didn't flinch. He had grown a thick skin over the years, a literal and metaphorical armor against the woman he had once adored. When they first married, she had praised his strength and his work ethic. But as her social ambitions grew, his blue-collar reality became her greatest shame. She hated his dark, weathered complexion, often making jokes about how he needed to scrub harder in the shower to wash away the blackness of his labor. It wasn't just about the dirt, it was a deep-seated prejudice against the very man who kept a roof over her head. Elena wanted a trophy, not a husband, and Mark was a reminder of a life she wanted to leave behind. "I'm doing my best, Elena," Mark replied quietly, his voice a low rumble. "The economy is tight. I'm working 12-hour shifts. I'm tired." Elena turned then, her eyes flashing with a cruel fire. "Tired? You're just lazy. You have no vision. You're 40 years old and you're still just a laborer. You're a dark stain on my life, Mark. If you died tomorrow, the only thing I'd miss is the paycheck, and even that is barely enough to keep me in the lifestyle I deserve." The words hung in the air, toxic and heavy. Mark looked down at his hands. He realized in that moment that the woman he loved had died years ago, replaced by this bitter, status-obsessed stranger. He felt a snap inside him, not a loud break, but a quiet, final click. The bridge had collapsed. He stood up slowly, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the polished floor. He didn't argue. He didn't shout. He simply walked to the hallway closet and pulled out a single duffel bag. Elena watched him, a smirk playing on her lips. "Oh, going to sleep on the sofa again? Or maybe you're going to go cry in your truck?" Mark didn't answer. He packed 3 shirts, 2 pairs of jeans, and his old work boots. He grabbed his passport from the small safe in the den and the few $100s he had tucked away for emergencies. "Where do you think you're going?" Elena asked, her smirk fading into a look of slight annoyance. "You have a shift tomorrow. You can't just walk out on your responsibilities." Mark zipped the bag and swung it over his shoulder. He walked to the front door and finally looked her in the eyes. For the first time in years, there was no sadness in his gaze, only a terrifying, empty space. "You're right, Elena," he said, his voice eerily calm. "I am a nobody. I'm a dark stain. So, I'm going to do you a favor. I'm going to remove myself from your sight. You won't have to worry about the smell of sweat or the sight of my skin ever again." He opened the door, the cold wind rushing in to meet him. Elena laughed, a high, mocking sound. "Fine, Go. See how far you get without me to manage your pathetic life. You'll be back in 2 days begging for a warm meal." Mark didn't look back. He stepped out into the night, the heavy thud of the door closing behind him echoing like a gavel in a courtroom. He climbed into his old, battered truck, the engine groaning to life. He didn't drive to a motel. He didn't drive to a friend's house. He drove toward the city lights, toward a future he had been secretly preparing for in the quietest corners of his mind. As the taillights of his truck vanished into the darkness, Elena stood behind the glass of her perfect home, unaware that the man she had just chased away was taking the keys to her kingdom with him. She thought she had won. She thought she was finally free of the burden of her husband. She had no idea that the real game was only just beginning, and that the man she despised was about to become someone she couldn't even imagine in her wildest dreams. The silence in the house after Mark left was exactly what Elena thought she wanted, but as the days turned into weeks, the silence began to feel like an accusation. She spent the first few days reveling in her freedom, throwing away his old work jackets and scrubbing the floors as if she could erase his physical presence from her life. She told her friends at brunch that Mark had finally cracked and run away, painting herself as the long-suffering wife who was better off without his drab energy weighing her down. However, the reality of her situation hit when the bills started arriving. Mark had been the sole provider, and while she had mocked his income, it was the only thing keeping her porcelain world from shattering. She tried to call him, first to yell, then to demand money, but his phone was disconnected. It was as if he had dropped off the face of the earth. Mark, meanwhile, was miles away in a bustling metropolis, standing in front of a glass skyscraper. He didn't look like a construction worker anymore. He had spent the last of his savings on a decent suit and a haircut, but the real transformation was internal. For years, Mark had been a silent partner in a small tech startup venture he'd funded with a modest inheritance from his grandfather, money he had never told Elena about because he knew she would have spent it on designer handbags. He had spent his nights after 10-hour shifts learning about logistics and infrastructure software. Now, he was no longer the man with dirt under his fingernails. He was a man with a vision. He met with his old contact, a brilliant coder named Julian, who had been waiting for Mark to finally take his seat at the table. "We thought you'd never show up," Julian said, shaking Mark's hand firmly. "The patent went through, Mark. We're not just a startup anymore. We're the future of urban development." Back in their hometown, Elena's life was spiraling. She had to sell her jewelry and eventually the house. She moved into a cramped, one-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of town, the very kind of neighborhood she used to mock. Her friends, the ones who had laughed at her jokes about Mark's dark skin and peasant hands, stopped calling when she could no longer afford the expensive lunches. She was bitter, blaming Mark for abandoning her, never once reflecting on the years of emotional abuse she had heaped upon him. She spent her nights scrolling through social media, looking for a sign of him, hoping to find him miserable and broken so she could feel superior once again. She wanted to see him failing, living in a shelter, proving her right that he was nothing without her. 5 years passed. Elena had managed to land a job as a receptionist at a high-end real estate firm, a position that galled her because she had to serve the kind of women she used to be. One afternoon, the office went into a frenzy. The firm had been acquired by a massive global conglomerate, Apex Holdings, and the new CEO was coming to visit the local branch. The rumors were that he was a billionaire, a self-made titan who was buying up half the commercial district. Elena straightened her skirt and applied a fresh layer of lipstick, her old predatory instincts kicking in. This was her chance. If she could catch the eye of a man like that, she could claw her way back to the top. She stood behind her desk, wearing her best approachable smile as a fleet of black SUVs pulled up to the curb. Security guards in crisp suits stepped out first, followed by a group of assistants carrying tablets. Then, the man himself stepped out. He was tall, his presence commanding the entire street. He wore a charcoal gray suit that fit his broad shoulders perfectly, the fabric shimmering with a quality Elena had only seen in magazines. His skin was deep and rich, glowing with health, and his hair was groomed to perfection. He looked like royalty. As he walked toward the glass doors, Elena felt her heart race. There was something familiar about the way he moved, a certain weight to his step. When he pushed through the doors and walked into the lobby, the air seemed to vibrate. Elena stepped forward, her voice trembling with practiced grace. "Good morning, sir. Welcome to our office. We are so honored to have—" The man stopped. He turned his head slowly, looking down at her. Behind his expensive designer glasses, his eyes were cold and sharp, like polished flint. He didn't smile. He didn't acknowledge her beauty. He looked at her with the same detached indifference one might show to a stray pebble on the sidewalk. Elena's words died in her throat. The man took off his glasses, revealing a face she hadn't seen in half a decade. The lines of exhaustion were gone, replaced by the sharp contours of power. The dark stain she had tried so hard to wash away was now the man who owned the building she worked in. "Mark?" she whispered, her face turning a ghostly shade of white. Mark didn't flinch at the sound of his name. He didn't look surprised or angry. He simply looked at her as if she were a ghost from a past life he had long since outgrown. "I believe you have some files for my legal team," he said, his voice deep and resonant, lacking any of the warmth he once had for her. Elena fumbled with the papers on her desk, her hands shaking so violently that she dropped a folder. Mark watched it hit the floor, his expression unchanging. He didn't bend down to help her. He didn't offer a kind word. He simply turned to his assistant. "Make sure the transition is smooth," he said. "I want this office cleared by the end of the month. We are moving operations to the new tower." "Mark, wait!" Elena cried out as he began to walk away. "Where have you been? You look incredible. We need to talk. I've had it so hard, Mark. I thought you were dead." Mark stopped at the base of the elevator and turned around. The entire office was watching, the silence echoing the same chill that used to inhabit their living room. "You thought I was nothing, Elena," he said quietly, loud enough only for her to hear. "You told me I was a stain. You told me I was embarrassing. Well, look at me now. I'm the man you said didn't exist, and as for talking, we'll do plenty of that through my lawyers. You'll be receiving the final divorce papers this evening. I've been waiting for the right moment to sign them. I wanted to make sure I owned everything you ever dreamed of before I cut you out of my life forever." The elevator doors hissed shut, leaving Elena standing in the middle of the lobby, the ruins of her pride scattered on the floor at her feet. The lobby was dead quiet, the only sound being the hum of the air conditioning and the frantic thudding of Elena's heart. She looked around at her coworkers, their eyes wide with a mix of shock and poorly hidden satisfaction. They had all endured her arrogance for years, listening to her talk about her refined taste and her high standards. Now, they had just witnessed the man she had called a nobody return as their ultimate boss. Elena felt a wave of nausea. She wanted to run after him, to scream, to apologize, to beg, but her legs felt like lead. Mark sat in the back of the SUV, the tinted windows shielding him from the world. He looked at his hands, the same hands that used to be covered in cement dust and grime. They were clean now, but he still remembered the sting of the chemicals and the way Elena used to recoil if he touched her before he had scrubbed himself raw. He pulled out his phone and sent a short text to his lead attorney. Proceed with the final phase. No settlements. No alimony. Just the truth. He didn't feel the rush of joy he thought he would. He felt a cold, clinical sense of completion. He wasn't the man who had left 5 years ago. That man had died in the driver's seat of an old truck on a dark highway. This man was a shark, built in the fires of spite and ambition. That evening, Elena was sitting in her dim apartment, a glass of cheap wine in her hand, when the knock came. She hurried to the door, hoping delusional enough to think that it might be Mark coming to tell her it was all a test. Instead, she found a man in a sharp black suit holding a thick envelope. "Elena Vance, you've been served," he said flatly, handing her the papers before turning on his heel. She ripped the envelope open. The first thing she saw was the letterhead of the most expensive law firm in the state. The second thing she saw was the word adultery. Her blood ran cold. How did he know? During the final year of their marriage, when she thought Mark was too tired and too stupid to notice, she had been seeing a local real estate agent. She had used Mark's overtime money to buy hotel rooms and dinners for another man, laughing about her dull husband behind his back. She thought she had covered her tracks perfectly. But the papers in her hand contained dates, times, and even photographs she didn't know existed. Mark hadn't been blind. He had been collecting evidence. He hadn't left because he was broken. He had left because he was finished. He had waited 5 years to serve these papers because he wanted to ensure he was so wealthy that her attempts to sue for half would be laughed out of court. The phone rang. It was her mother, the woman who had encouraged Elena to find a better class of man. "Elena, have you seen the news?" her mother shrieked. "The new tech mogul, Marcus Vance. Is that him? Is that the man you threw out? People are saying he's worth hundreds of millions." Elena dropped the phone. The room felt like it was closing in. She realized that by treating him like dirt, she had literally thrown away a fortune. But it was worse than that. She realized she had never actually known the man she was married to. She had looked at the color of his skin and the dirt on his clothes and assumed he had no mind, no heart, and no future. She spent the night pacing. She decided she wouldn't give up. If Mark had been a good man once, she could find that man again. She would remind him of their early days, of the small apartment they shared when they were 20. She would dress in the colors he used to like. She would apologize. She would tell him she was lost and confused, and that his departure had been the wake-up call she needed. She convinced herself that under that expensive suit, he was still the same soft-hearted guy who would do anything to make her smile. The next morning, she arrived at the Apex Holdings headquarters. She bypassed the security desk by using her old credentials from the real estate firm, claiming she had urgent documents for the CEO's transition team. She made it to the executive floor, her heart hammering against her ribs. When she saw him through the glass walls of his office, he was standing by the window, looking out over the city he now partially owned. He looked like a king surveying his domain. She pushed past his frantic secretary and burst into the room. "Mark, please, just listen to me," she cried, her voice cracking with forced emotion. Mark didn't turn around immediately. He let the silence stretch until it was uncomfortable, until Elena was standing in the middle of the plush carpet, looking small and desperate. When he finally turned, his face was a mask of indifference. "You're trespassing, Elena," he said, his voice as smooth as silk and as hard as iron. "I'm not here for a scene. I'm here for us," she sobbed, taking a step toward him. "I made a mistake. I was young. I was arrogant. I didn't realize what I had. But seeing you yesterday, it reminded me of why I fell in love with you. We can start over. We don't need the lawyers." Mark let out a short, dry laugh that didn't reach his eyes. "You didn't fall in love with me yesterday, Elena. You fell in love with the building. You fell in love with the suit. If I had walked into that lobby in my old work boots, you would have had security throw me out." He walked closer to her, and for the first time, she saw the true scale of his transformation. He loomed over her, not with the slouch of a tired laborer, but with the posture of a predator. "You didn't just hate my job, Elena. You hated me. You hated my skin. You hated my soul. And you betrayed our vows while I was out breaking my back for you." He threw a folder onto the desk. "I know everything. Now, get out before I have you arrested." Elena's face contorted, her mask of regret slipping to reveal the jagged edges of her panic. She reached out to touch his arm, but Mark stepped back as if her touch were toxic. "You can't do this, Mark. We were married for 15 years. You can't just erase that because you got rich," she screamed, her voice losing its melodic quality and turning shrill. "I'll tell everyone how you abandoned me. I'll tell the press that the great Marcus Vance is a man who leaves his wife to starve while he builds an empire." Mark leaned back against his mahogany desk, crossing his arms. He didn't look threatened. He looked amused. "Go ahead," he said calmly. "Tell them. Tell them how you spent our mortgage money on your lover's car payments. Tell them how you called me a dark stain in front of our neighbors. I have the recordings, Elena. I had a security system installed in our old house months before I left. I saw the way you looked at me. I heard the things you said when you thought I was already asleep. You didn't think a dumb laborer knew how to check a cloud server, did you?" The color drained from Elena's face. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Mark hadn't just been working. He had been observing. He had been a ghost in his own home, documenting his own demise. Every insult she had hurled, every late-night rendezvous she thought was a secret, was filed away in a digital vault. She was trapped. She looked around the opulent office, realizing that every luxury she saw was a reminder of what she could have had if she had simply been a decent human being. "I have a business to run," Mark said, checking his watch. It was a Patek Philippe, a watch that cost more than their old house. "My security will escort you out. If you set foot on this property again, I'll file a restraining order." "And Elena?" He paused, his eyes narrowing. "Don't bother looking for your lover, David. He was one of the first people I fired when I bought the real estate firm this morning. It turns out he was skimming off the top of his commissions. He's currently facing his own legal battles. You really have a type, don't you? Disloyal people tend to find each other." 2 security guards appeared at the door. They didn't use force, but their presence was absolute. Elena felt the eyes of the entire executive floor on her as she was led to the elevator. She felt smaller than she ever had when she was looking down at Mark. The power dynamic hadn't just shifted, it had flipped entirely. As the elevator doors closed, the last thing she saw was Mark turning back to his window, already forgetting she existed. He didn't hate her anymore. Hate required energy. To Mark, she was simply a bad investment he had finally liquidated. She walked out of the building and into the humid afternoon air. The city felt like a giant machine designed to crush her. She had no job, no husband, no home, and now, even her backup plan, her lover, was a disgraced ruin. She sat on a park bench across from the Apex Tower, watching the sunlight glint off the glass. She thought about the man who used to come home covered in dust, the man who would rub her feet and tell her that everything would be okay. She had traded that man for a fantasy of status, and in the process, she had created the very monster that was now destroying her. But the drama wasn't over. While Elena was mourning her lost lifestyle, Mark was moving into the next phase of his plan. He didn't just want her gone. He wanted her to understand the depth of her failure. He called his head of PR. "The documentary about my life," Mark said into the phone. "The one we're producing for the Underdog to Icon series? I want to include the early footage. I want the world to see the struggle. All of it. Don't blur the faces of the people who doubted me. Let them be a part of the history." Mark knew that in the age of social media, reputation was the only currency that mattered. By the time he was done, Elena wouldn't just be poor, she would be a pariah. He wasn't doing it out of a need for blood. He was doing it because he believed in consequences. He had spent 40 years being the man who followed the rules, the man who took the hits and kept moving. He was done taking hits. It was time to show the world that the man they called a nobody was the only one who truly knew how to build something that lasted. The following weeks were a slow-motion collapse for Elena. News of Marcus Vance's rise to power had become the talk of the town, but the narrative wasn't just about his wealth, it was about his character. Mark began a strategic media campaign, not by attacking Elena directly, but by highlighting his journey. He did interviews where he spoke about the years of psychological weight he carried, the constant reminders that his hard work wasn't enough, and the subtle, painful stabs at his identity and appearance he endured in his previous life. He never named her, but in their social circles, everyone knew. The dark stain comment had leaked, some say. Mark's own legal team ensured it reached the right ears. Elena found herself invisible. When she walked into a local boutique, the clerks who once tripped over themselves to serve her suddenly found themselves very busy with other tasks. The shame she had once tried to project onto Mark had clung to her like a second skin. She was now the woman who had mocked a king when he was a laborer. She was the symbol of every shallow, unfaithful partner the world loved to hate. Her phone, once buzzing with social invitations, was now a digital graveyard. Even her mother had stopped calling, busy trying to distance herself from Elena's poor judgment in hopes of somehow reconciling with Mark for a piece of the pie. Desperate and running out of money, Elena tried to find work at other firms, but the industry was small. Everywhere she went, the shadow of Apex Holdings loomed. No one wanted to hire the ex-wife of the man who was currently buying up the city's skyline. It was a silent blacklisting, a cold wall of professional rejection that mirrored the emotional wall she had built against Mark for years. One evening, sitting in her dark apartment because she was behind on the electricity bill, she received a message from an unknown number. It was a link to a video. She clicked it. It was a trailer for a high-production documentary titled The Foundation of Power. The screen showed grainy, old footage from a hidden camera, Mark's old house. It showed Mark coming home, exhausted, his face covered in the very dust she used to loathe. Then, it showed her. It showed her standing over him, her face twisted in a sneer that looked demonic in the low light. The audio was crisp. "You're a dark stain on my life, Mark," her own voice echoed through the speakers of her phone. The screen then cut to the present day. Mark, standing on a helipad, looking polished, powerful, and undeniably regal. The contrast was staggering. The video had millions of views. The comments section was a battlefield of public execution. Users from all over the world were calling her a villain, a gold digger, and a soul crusher. She realized then that Mark's revenge wasn't just about taking away her money or her marriage. He had taken away her narrative. He had turned her into a cautionary tale for the entire world to see. She wasn't just a divorcee. She was a global archetype of betrayal. Trembling, she grabbed her coat and drove to the one place she thought he might still be, the old construction site where they had first met, a place Mark had recently bought to turn into a community center. She found him there, standing amidst the skeletal frame of the building. He wasn't wearing a suit this time. He was in a simple black sweater and slacks, looking at a set of blueprints. The sight of him, so calm and centered, made her chest ache with a mixture of rage and profound regret. "Was this necessary?" she screamed, stepping into the light of the work lamps. "To humiliate me like this? To put our private life on display for the whole world to mock?" Mark didn't look up from the blueprints. He traced a line with his finger, his movements deliberate. "I didn't put our life on display, Elena," he said, his voice carrying effortlessly through the open structure. "I put the truth on display. You were the one who wrote the script. I just provided the cameras." "I have nothing left," she sobbed, collapsing onto a pile of lumber. "I'm losing my home, I have no job, and everyone looks at me like I'm a monster." Finally, Mark looked at her. His eyes weren't filled with the anger she expected. They were filled with a terrifying, hollow pity. "You're not a monster, Elena," he said softly. "You're just a woman who believed her own lies. You thought status was a shield that allowed you to be cruel. You thought my skin and my sweat made me less of a man. You weren't looking at me for 15 years, you were looking at a reflection of your own insecurities." He walked over to her, stopping just a few feet away. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn object. It was the wedding ring he had worn for 15 years, the one he had taken off the night he left. He dropped it into the dust at her feet. "I worked 3 jobs to buy that," he said, "because I thought you were worth the sacrifice. It turns out the only thing that was dirty in that house was your heart. You can keep the ring. Sell it. It might pay for another month of your apartment. It's the last thing I will ever give you." The ring lay in the dirt, a tiny glint of gold against the gray concrete and construction dust. Elena stared at it, her fingers trembling as she reached down to pick it up. It felt cold, colder than the winter air. This was the man who had once worshipped her, the man who had stayed up late into the night just to make sure she had the finest things in life. Now, he looked at her with the detached curiosity of a scientist looking at a specimen. There was no love left to exploit, no anger left to trigger. There was only the void. "Mark, please," she whispered, the ring clutched tight in her palm. "I can change. I've seen what I've done. This life I'm living now, it's a nightmare. I've learned my lesson." Mark let out a soft, weary sigh. He looked at the structure around him, the rising steel, the firm foundation. "The thing about foundations, Elena, is that if they are built on sand, the whole building eventually falls. We were built on sand." Your love was contingent on my performance, my bank account, and how well I fit into your shallow social circle. You don't want me. You want the man who can make the nightmare go away." He turned back to his blueprints, effectively ending the conversation. "Go home, Elena, or whatever is left of it. My lawyers will send the final decree tomorrow. There will be no more meetings, no more accidental run-ins. You are a part of my history, not my future." The security team, ever present and silent, stepped forward to guide her away. This time, Elena didn't fight. She walked out of the construction site, her heels clicking hollowly on the pavement. She realized that the dark man she had once looked down upon had become a sun so bright it had burned her entire world to ashes. As Mark watched her silhouette disappear into the night, he felt a weight lift off his chest that he hadn't even realized he was carrying. For 5 years, the fire of revenge had been his primary fuel. It had driven him to work 20-hour days, to navigate the cutthroat world of venture capital, and to build an empire out of nothing. But seeing her broken and desperate didn't give him the thrill he expected. It just made him feel finished. The debt was settled. The stain was gone. The next morning, the news broke that Marcus Vance was donating $50 million to vocational schools and scholarship funds for children from blue-collar backgrounds. The headline read, "The Builder Who Never Forgot His Roots." In his interview, Mark spoke with a profound dignity. "People often judge a book by its cover, or a man by the dirt on his clothes," he told the reporter. "But the real measure of a person is what they do when they are at their lowest. I was told I was nothing. I was told my skin made me an embarrassment. I'm here to tell every kid out there that the only person who can define your worth is you." The public's adoration for Mark reached an all-time high. He wasn't just a billionaire. He was a hero, a symbol of the underdog's triumph. Meanwhile, the divorce decree arrived at Elena's door. It was final. Because of the ironclad evidence of her infidelity and her emotional abuse, the lifestyle maintenance she had hoped for was denied. She was left with a small, one-time settlement, enough to get by for a few months, but a pittance compared to the millions Mark was now worth. She was officially a stranger to the life she once thought was her birthright. Elena sat in her apartment, surrounded by packed boxes. She had to move out by the end of the week. She picked up a fashion magazine, the kind she used to obsess over. There, on the third page, was a photo of Mark at a gala. He was standing next to a woman who looked nothing like Elena. This woman didn't wear heavy makeup or flash expensive jewelry. She was a renowned architect, known for her intelligence and her philanthropy. They were laughing, a genuine, easy laugh that Mark had never shared with Elena. The caption called them the power couple of the new era. A hot tear rolled down Elena's cheek, splashing onto the glossy page. She realized that Mark hadn't just replaced her. He had upgraded his entire existence. He was living the life she had always dreamed of, but he was doing it with someone who actually respected him. She looked at her reflection in the darkened television screen. She looked old. She looked bitter. The beauty she had relied on for so long was fading, eroded by the stress of her own making. She had tried to play a game of status, and she had lost everything not because Mark was cruel, but because she had been hollow. The following months were a masterclass in psychological isolation. Elena moved to a small, nameless town 2 hours away, hoping to escape the whispers and the pitying looks of those who knew her story. She took a job at a local diner, wearing a uniform that felt like a straitjacket of shame. Every time a customer complained about their coffee or a smudge on a plate, she felt a phantom echo of her own voice from years ago, berating Mark for the smallest infractions. She was now on the receiving end of the world's impatience, and the irony was a bitter pill she swallowed every morning. Meanwhile, Marcus Vance was no longer just a name. He was an institution. He had successfully launched a series of smart cities initiatives that utilized his infrastructure software to reduce homelessness and optimize public transport. He was the man of the hour, frequently appearing on news segments to discuss the future of urban living. But for Mark, the public success was secondary to his private peace. He had moved into a sprawling estate, not the gaudy, gold-leafed mansion Elena would have chosen, but a masterpiece of modern architecture built with sustainable materials and filled with light. One evening, Mark sat in his study, looking at a digital file his private investigator had sent. It contained photos of Elena at the diner. She looked exhausted, her hair pulled back in a messy knot, her once manicured hands red and raw from dishwater. His assistant, a loyal man who had been with him since the early days of the startup, stood by the door. "Do you want to proceed with the next phase of the acquisition, sir? We've identified the holding company that owns the plaza where her apartment is located." Mark looked at the photo of Elena for a long time. He saw the woman who had called him a dark stain, the woman who had laughed while he bled for their future. He had the power to make her homeless. He had the money to buy the very ground she stood on and cast her out again. It would be the final, crushing blow. But as he looked at her tired eyes, he realized something profound. The fire that had burned in him for 5 years, the need to see her suffer, had finally gone out. It hadn't been extinguished by her misery, but by his own contentment. "No," Mark said, closing the laptop. "Cancel the acquisition. Leave her be." The assistant looked surprised. "Sir? After everything she put you through? You said you wanted her to feel the full weight of her choices." Mark stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city lights. "She is feeling it. Every day she wakes up in that life, she feels it. To continue chasing her would mean she still has a hold on me. I don't want to be the man who destroys a waitress. I want to be the man who forgets she exists." It was the ultimate victory. True revenge wasn't the destruction of the enemy, it was the total indifference toward them. Mark realized that by obsessing over her downfall, he was still tethering his soul to hers. He decided right then to stop looking at the reports. He instructed his legal team to finalize all remaining paperwork and to never bring her name up again. He was cutting the final thread. He was finally, truly free. Back at the diner, Elena was closing up for the night. She sat in a booth, her feet aching, and pulled out her phone. She looked at the latest news about Marcus. He was being honored at a global summit. There was a video of his speech. "Success isn't about what you own," he told the crowd of dignitaries. "It's about who you become in the process of losing everything. I lost my pride, my home, and my sense of self. But in that darkness, I found a strength that no one could take away from me." Elena felt a lump in her throat. She realized that while she had tried to dim his light, she had only acted as the catalyst for his greatness. She had been the villain in his story, the obstacle he had to overcome to reach his true potential. And what was she now? A footnote, a shadow. She realized that even if she stayed in this small town for the rest of her life, she would always be the woman who was too blind to see a diamond in the rough. She put her phone away and began to mop the floor, the rhythmic movement a haunting reminder of the man she had once mocked for doing the very same thing. The transition from being a woman of high society to a woman of the shadows was complete. Elena's life had become a series of repetitive, grueling tasks. The smell of cheap grease and industrial cleaner had replaced the scent of Chanel No. 5. But the hardest part wasn't the work, it was the isolation. In her previous life, she had surrounded herself with people who mirrored her vanity. Now, she realized that those people weren't friends, they were vultures. They had fed on her status, and once that status was gone, they had picked her bones clean and moved on. One rainy Tuesday, a black sedan pulled up to the diner. It wasn't an SUV from Apex Holdings, but it was expensive enough to make the locals stare. A man in a tailored suit walked in, shaking an umbrella. He didn't look like a customer. He scanned the room until his eyes landed on Elena, who was wiping down a counter. He approached her with a professional, distant expression. "Elena Vance?" he asked. She nodded slowly, her heart skipping a beat. Was this more bad news? Was Mark coming for the little she had left? "I'm a representative from the Vance Foundation," the man said, placing a document on the counter. "Mr. Vance has instructed us to settle all outstanding debts in this county as part of his New Beginnings initiative. Your name appeared on the list of local residents with significant predatory high-interest loans." Elena stared at the paper. It was a release form. Mark wasn't buying her building to kick her out. He had bought her debt, the crushing credit card bills she had racked up trying to maintain her image, and he was wiping them clean. "Why?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "After everything, why would he do this?" The representative adjusted his glasses. "Mr. Vance didn't single you out, Miss Vance. He told the board that everyone deserves a chance to start from zero, rather than from under the ground. He isn't doing this for you. He's doing this for the community. You just happen to be part of it." The man turned to leave, but stopped at the door. "He also asked me to give you this. It's a personal message." He handed her a small, handwritten note. Elena's hands shook as she unfolded it. It wasn't on expensive stationery. It was a simple piece of paper, reminiscent of the notes Mark used to leave her on the kitchen counter before he left for his construction shifts. It read, "The debt is paid. Not just the money, but the anger. I am no longer the man you hurt, and you are no longer the woman who can hurt me. This is the last time you will hear from me. Use this freedom to find a soul worth keeping." Elena sank onto a stool, the tears finally coming, not tears of rage or greed, but tears of pure, agonizing realization. He had forgiven her, but not in a way that allowed her back into his life. His forgiveness was a final door slamming shut. He had elevated himself so far above her that he could afford to be merciful to his greatest enemy. She looked at her reflection in the stainless steel of the napkin dispenser. For the first time, she didn't look for wrinkles or flaws in her beauty. She looked at the person underneath, and she didn't like what she saw. She spent that night in her small apartment, looking at the ceiling. For years, she had blamed her skin color, her upbringing, and her lack of luxury for her unhappiness. She had blamed Mark's darkness for her own lack of light. But with the debt gone and the slate wiped clean, she realized the truth. The darkness had always been hers. Mark had been the sun, and she had spent 15 years trying to eclipse him because she was afraid of how brightly he could shine. She decided then that she wouldn't stay in the shadows. She wouldn't go back to her old ways of trying to find a wealthy man to save her. She would take the zero Mark had given her and build something of her own. It wouldn't be a billion-dollar empire, and it wouldn't be a glass skyscraper. It would be a life built on the one thing she had never possessed: integrity. She began to look at the other women in the diner, women who worked hard, women who were tired, women she used to look down on. For the first time in her life, she felt a sense of sisterhood. She was no longer a queen in exile. She was a human being among humans. A year had passed since the debt was wiped clean, and the world had moved on. Marcus Vance was no longer just a business tycoon. He was a global icon of transformation. He had recently married the architect he was seen with, a woman named Sarah, who shared his passion for building a world based on merit rather than appearance. Their wedding wasn't a circus for the paparazzi. It was a private ceremony on a plot of land where Mark had laid his very first foundation as a young laborer. He was a man who had come full circle, finding peace in the very earth he once toiled over. Elena, far from the cameras and the glitz, had undergone her own quiet revolution. She still worked at the diner, but she was no longer the woman who wiped counters with a sneer. She had become the manager, a role she earned not through manipulation, but through the same grueling work ethic she once mocked in Mark. She lived in the same small apartment, but it was now filled with books on business management and psychology. She was learning to build her own foundation, stone by heavy stone. One afternoon, a young man walked into the diner. He was wearing dusty work clothes, his face smeared with the grime of a nearby road construction project. He looked exhausted, his shoulders slumped with the weight of a long shift. He sat at the counter, and Elena noticed the way some of the younger, trendier customers moved away from him, crinkling their noses at the scent of asphalt and sweat. It was a scene she had participated in 1,000 times before. Elena walked over to him, but she didn't just hand him a menu. She brought him a tall glass of cold water and a genuine smile. "Rough day on the site?" she asked softly. The young man looked up, surprised by the kindness in her voice. "Yeah," he muttered, wiping his forehead. "It's hard work, and people. They don't exactly look at you like you're human when you're covered in this stuff." Elena felt a sharp pang in her chest, a ghost of a memory from a life she had long since buried. "Don't let them define you," Elena said, leaning against the counter. "The dirt on your hands just means you're building something the rest of the world is too soft to handle. You're the foundation, and without you, none of this exists." The young man blinked, a small spark of pride lighting up his tired eyes. He thanked her, and for the first time in years, Elena felt a sense of purpose that didn't involve a price tag or a social standing. She was finally beginning to understand the soul worth keeping that Mark had written about. She occasionally saw Mark on the news, but she no longer felt the urge to reach out or cry. She watched him with a distant, respectful silence. He was a monument to what a person could achieve when they channeled pain into progress. She realized that her revenge against her own past was to become someone he wouldn't recognize, not because she was rich, but because she was kind. She had spent 40 years being a consumer of people's energy. She was finally becoming a producer. As she closed the diner that night, she stopped by the small park in the center of town. There was a bronze plaque there, recently installed, commemorating the Vance Foundation's contribution to the local community. She touched the cold metal, her fingers tracing the name Marcus Vance. She didn't feel regret anymore. She felt gratitude. If he hadn't left, if he hadn't stripped away her delusions, she would have died a bitter, hollow woman in a golden cage. He had saved her by leaving her. The story of the dark stain had become a local legend, but the ending had changed. It was no longer a story about a man who got rich and crushed his ex-wife. It was a story about two people who were forced to look into the mirror of their own souls. One had found a kingdom, and the other had found herself. As Elena walked back to her apartment under the vast, starlit sky, she realized that the greatest luxury in the world wasn't a silk robe or a designer handbag. It was the ability to lay your head on the pillow at night and know that you were finally, truly, a person of substance. The final chapter of Marcus Vance's journey was not written in the boardrooms of skyscrapers, but in the quiet legacy he left behind. By the time he reached his late 40s, he had become more than a billionaire. He was a philosopher of the working class. He often visited the construction sites of his new projects, not in a suit, but in the rugged gear he had never truly outgrown. He would sit with the laborers, sharing their lunch and listening to their stories. He became the voice for the invisible men and women who built the world, ensuring they were paid fairly, treated with dignity, and never looked down upon for the color of their skin or the grit on their brows. His marriage to Sarah flourished because it was built on mutual respect, a concept Elena had never understood. Sarah didn't care about the shimmer of his wealth. She cared about the strength of his character. Together, they founded the Vance Academy, a school dedicated to teaching both technical skills and emotional intelligence. Mark's message was simple. To build a structure, you need steel. To build a life, you need integrity. He had turned his personal tragedy into a universal triumph, proving that the most powerful revenge is a life lived so well that the past no longer has the power to shadow the present. Elena, too, found her peace. She eventually bought the small diner where she had worked for years, using the savings she had earned through honest, back-breaking labor. She renamed it the Foundation. It became a place where everyone was welcome, especially those who worked the hardest and were noticed the least. She never married again, but she was never lonely. She was surrounded by a community that respected her for her kindness and her resilience. She had finally scrubbed away the only stain that ever mattered, the one on her own heart. One morning, a package arrived at the diner. There was no return address, only a small box wrapped in plain brown paper. Inside, Elena found a small, polished stone, a piece of the very first foundation Mark had ever poured. Along with it was a final note, typed on the official letterhead of the Vance Foundation. It simply said, "The building is complete." Elena smiled, a genuine, warm expression that reached her eyes. She placed the stone on her mantle, a reminder that while gold can melt and wealth can vanish, a solid foundation lasts forever. Mark and Elena's story became a whisper in the winds of the city, a modern-day parable about the dangers of arrogance and the beauty of redemption. It served as a reminder that the person you choose to dismiss today might be the one who holds the keys to your future tomorrow. Mark had walked away from a toxic life and walked into a destiny he created with his own two hands. He had proven that no matter how much the world tries to darken your spirit, the light of your own will can turn any shadow into a masterpiece. As the sun set over the city, casting a golden glow on the skyline Marcus Vance had helped shape, the echoes of the past finally went silent. The construction worker and the socialite were gone, replaced by a man of honor and a woman of substance. The cycle of betrayal was broken, replaced by the enduring power of growth. In the end, it wasn't about the money, the divorce, or the fame. It was about the journey from being a nobody to becoming someone who truly mattered not to the world, but to themselves. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey here at Dr. Harmony. If this story touched your heart or reminded you of the incredible strength of the human spirit, please give this video a thumbs up. We love hearing your thoughts, so leave a comment below about what you would have done in Mark's shoes. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another story of betrayal, growth, and redemption. Your support helps us keep bringing these powerful narratives to life. Until next time, remember to look deeper than the surface, because everyone you meet is fighting a battle you know nothing about. Take care of yourselves and each other.